Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 13th of November now. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information around Alaska. You can do that easily by using your phone, 1-800-472-0391. Find us online at weather.gov/Alaska or on your mobile device, mobile.weather.gov. Or if you can't find what you're looking for, just send me an email, david.snider@noaa.gov. Here's a look at what's going on. First, we're going to look at southeast, which is right behind me. Here we go. In southeast, you can see a lot of red there, generally south of Sitka and east into the central inner channels there. A high wind warning is expected to continue until at least 6 o'clock tonight. Gusts there up to 65 miles per hour are possible, and loose items may be blown around as a result of that very tight pressure gradient and low pressure park just off coast of Sitka there. As this moves through, it's still going to be breezy. There will still be some rain hazards that we'll see here in just a little bit with the latest forecast, but in the meantime, do expect some pretty blustery conditions as we go through the remainder of the afternoon into the evening hours across central and southern parts of southeast. Now, everything up north gets another map. Here we go. Winter weather advisories all the way from the south slopes of the Brooks Range up to the upper Koabuk and Noatak valleys, all the way into the upper Kuskokwim and out to the Yukon Delta. And eastward, with the exception of the Deltana and Tanana Flats region, every part of the interior is looking at wind and probably some light snow, at least 1 to 2 inches, in a few cases about 2 to 4. Generally speaking, gusts up to about 35-40 miles an hour will be possible, and they're going to be most noticeable over the highway summits there. So if you're traveling on the Steese, the Richardson, the Elliott Highway, and you're going up over the top, you're going to run into some wind and probably some poor visibility. It's also wintertime in the interior, right? So you should know this. Be careful out there. Roads will be slick. Visibility may be down briefly to maybe as much as a half mile. And this is going to continue as we go through the evening and the overnight hours there. Probably looking at about 6 o'clock in the morning before you see a lot of this go away, meaning conditions should have improved by then. We have a pretty tight pressure gradient, and that's bringing in a lot of easterly winds across the region. Again, some of those could be gusting up to about 40-45 miles per hour. Some places that have already seen some snow, apparently Circle has been snowing for the last day or so at least. You picked up about a foot just in the last 24 hours as we hear it. And that makes it about, 17 inches on the ground now in Circle. So doing okay for snow in the last couple days. So keep that up. It's starting to look like wintertime a little bit more. Fairbanks has had about 4 to 5 inches or so just today alone. So it is snowing around the interior, especially the central interior. Out west, a high surf advisory continues for St. Lawrence Island, Wales, Little Diomede, and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula. Because of the wind that's blowing through there, the surf is coming up and crashing on the shore. Coastal erosion might be minor in this case, not expecting anything really substantial, but there could be some minor issues with that. So be advised, a high surf advisory continues there until about 6 o'clock in the morning as well. So winter weather advisories on land, high surf advisory out there along the coast. Here's a look at the weather picture now. Low pressure here in southeast is what's really bringing in that wind. Look how quickly that wraps up and moves right up from south to north, right across the outer coast. It's a pretty picture on satellite, but underneath probably pretty tumultuous there as that wind is blowing through. Several other lows are found on the map there. We've got one across the western Gulf, another one that's even well south of that will pick up and move northward fairly quickly. This is going to spread out into the southern Bering Sea as we go through the rest of the week and kind of be that anchor to pull up even more storms coming in across the western Gulf in the next several days. In the meantime, everything that's going on across the interior today is really because high pressure is up in the north, and we've got a large expansive area of low pressure across the Gulf and across the the eastern Gulf, the western Gulf, and even the southern Bering. So because of that, we've just got a really fast conveyor belt that's working right through the Yukon Valley and producing that strong area of wind. Now for south central, skies have been generally clear. Same for southwestern Alaska, but as you get north of the Kuskokwim, those clouds fill in fairly quickly, and some of them have been adding some light amounts of snow. You can see that stretching all the way from Makoriak and Nunivak Island to the northern Yukon Delta into Norton Sound, also across places like Tanana, and then northwest toward Ambler, and then into the Yukon Flats north of Eagle, and even southward there, a little bit of snow over the Fairbanks region. And south of that, the winds just almost fall off. We did have some blustery conditions across south central as we went into the overnight hours this morning. The conditions have completely switched around and turned into a fairly nice day. And then we have the low across southeast, 985 millibars, a stronger low there across the north and western Gulf. So that's today's weather with high pressure up across the north slope at over 1,030 millibars. As we get into tonight, the low is going to kind of quickly zip northward into the southern Yukon. Another low will swing in behind that, so we'll keep breezy conditions going through southeast at least, with showers there and maybe some snow up across the higher terrain, but it should not be quite as strong. So look for rapid improvement in that wind for central and southern parts of southeast. Across south central, we'll see a few more clouds. Prince William Sound still looking at some generally partly to mostly cloudy conditions, I would say. Out to the south and west, look for a low pressure system north of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, around 1,000 millibars. The low across the interior here will still keep a lot of this wind working across the region, so that's why we're going to talk about this wind at least until about 6 o'clock in the morning. The crossed arrow points, that means blowing snow is seen. That means potential for a reduction in visibility. Doesn't necessarily mean that snow is falling from the sky, though in many cases it will be across the Yukon Valley all the way out to the Yukon Delta. High pressure sits up north on the coastal plain at 1,032 millibars, helping to move that weather right along. And you can see that really doesn't change a whole lot for Wednesday. The axis of really active wind will probably shift a little bit further south away from the Brooks Range and not really south of the Alaska Range. So in that small quarter, which includes pretty much everywhere around the Richardson all the way out toward the Yukon Delta, it still may be snowing in some cases and you may still have some wind. Low pressure will just hover right there around Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, around 1,000 millibars. Rain possibly for Nikolsky as well, up toward the Pribilovs, and then north of that it gets into a rain and snow mix. Southeast, a low pressure system that's zipping up your way tomorrow afternoon might have enough oomph to have a little bit of shower and storm activity on the south side. We saw a furious amount of lightning in that same region today, so that combined with the expansive area of big pressure difference really added to the storm's veracity. This afternoon leads into your Thursday with changing weather conditions for southeast. It looks like we'll probably have a little bit less wind across southeast as we get toward the end of the week, and the focus is going to shift a little bit more toward the western Gulf at 985 millibars there. You can see this expansive trough moving its way up toward the Pribilovs. On the north side of that you have snow, on the south side of that you've got rain all the way across the Alaska Peninsula, and this triple point area here is usually where we start to see a little bit more of that active weather, a little more heavy rain moving through. High pressure across the Alcan border is pushing south and west. That's going to help to clear up the sky, and it's going to make that pressure gradient and the wind that follows that more likely to occur around Kodiak Island, south central, southwest, all the way up toward the Seward Peninsula. And another low coming in across the west is going to stir up the wind for the western chain all the way out toward Atka, it looks like, by Thursday afternoon. Here's your temperatures for tonight quickly. You'll look at temperatures in the 30s and 40s for southeast, south central near freezing, 40 in Kodiak. As you move northward toward Healy and the Denali area, about 4 degrees, 10 or so around Fairbanks, 5 below for Fort Yukon, 6 below for Utqiagvik, just east toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, anywhere from 10 to 20 below. Kotzebue Sound temperatures about 5 to 10 above, 17 in Nome, and teens and 20s for most of southwest, 30 or so around King Salmon. As you get into high temperatures tomorrow, we're still talking single digits for most of the north and the interior. North slope anywhere from about 0 to 12. Southeast in the 40s, south central above freezing but barely. Kodiak Island looking at 45. Bristol Bay temps in the mid to upper 30s. 38 in St. Paul, 32 for St. Lawrence Island. Mid 40s for the Alaska Peninsula.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to flying weather now. IFR is expected across southwest Alaska and hit and miss across the Alaska Peninsula up toward Kodiak Island. You'll see some breaks in the MVFR across south central. Some of your western passes may start out with IFR. A large part of the eastern Alaska Range into the Copper River Valley and most of the higher terrain in southeast, including Chilkoot and White Pass, will start out with IFR. And look for generally VFR conditions for your north slope communities as well as north of the Yukon Valley. But right along the northern coastline, MVFR will be lurking for tomorrow. Most of the interior should linger under VFR conditions for most of the afternoon tomorrow. For south central, look for improving conditions here. MVFR stretching out of the Copper River Valley and into the upper Tanana Valley, where you could find a better chance of IFR. And hit and miss MVFR and IFR scattered around southeastern Alaska with a threat of convection just outside and south of Sitka and outside of the Dixon entrance. Across the Bering, IFR will extend from about Hooper Bay and just west to St. Matthew Island, and then hit and miss across some of our south and western capes, as well as the Alaska Peninsula, with MVFR fairly widespread again across the open water. Watch for hit and miss IFR for Thursday morning for southwest. Once again, covering up most of the Alaska Peninsula, especially around Falls Pass, Cold Bay, all the way up toward Port Huyden, and just about to Lake Iliamna before you get back into VFR. and that should continue for most of the interior. Most of the northern Gulf right along the coastline should be okay, but once you get back into central and southern parts of southeast, you're looking at least MVFR and maybe IFR as you get up toward Ketchikan and perhaps even Hyder. By the afternoon, similar conditions there for central and southern parts of southeast, northern southeast all the way to south central, most of southwest, and most of the interior should be VFR for Thursday afternoon, but you'll see a little bit of MVFR sneaking up into the Kuskokwim Delta and some of the higher terrain there. IFR conditions expected around Kodiak Island down toward the windward side of the Alaska Peninsula, Nunivak Island northward toward St. Lawrence Island, and out across the western end of the Aleutians, as well as areas east of Point Barrow. Here's a look at your pass conditions, and for your Wednesday, Anaktuvik and Anigan Pass we expect to be all clear. VFR conditions there to start out your Wednesday. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass should start out at MVFR, heading toward VFR conditions as the day goes on. Rainy Pass looking at an IFR start. Same goes for Windy Pass, but you might hold on to MVFR a little bit longer there. Isabel Pass we expect to see IFR conditions, probably some improvement throughout the day to MVFR. IFR conditions for Mentasta Pass pretty much all day long. You might see some marginal improvement there toward Tanita Pass. Portage Pass probably marginal, and then improving even more as we get into your Wednesday, and Thursday looks pretty good. Chilkoot and White Pass at this point looking to stay at IFR pretty much all day long. The freezing levels indicate that there's still some warmer air hovering over southeast, but that's really about where it stops. We have some low-level warmth there across south central, southwestern Alaska to Kodiak Island, but generally north of southwest all the way into the interior, we're talking about levels at or below freezing for your Wednesday morning. Icing potential is a little bit higher up there, between about 2,000 and 4,000 feet, and also across the Bering Sea into the central and eastern chain above 6,000 feet. And for most of southeastern Alaska, at least some isolated moderate threat exists, generally above that 6,000-foot mark. A look at our jet stream shows pretty active structure here across the North Pacific and through the Gulf, with wind speeds easily at 100 knots, plus another wave of low pressure being spun up by this overall motion is keeping the south winds out over southwestern Alaska at around 50 knots, and then a steady northerly flow coming into the Alaska Range and a good chunk of south central at about 65 knots, a little bit of a ridge here across the Alcan border, and high pressure up across eastern Asia helping to keep that cold air funneling into the Bering Sea and working with low pressure here across the Gulf. At 9,000 feet, a broad offshore flow is really going strong, anywhere from 20 to 50 knots across Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula, keeping that northerly cold wind coming. Northerlies for the Aleutian Chain, high pressure setting up across south central. A southerly wind results over the southwest and Bristol Bay, and light offshore flow across northern southeast, with light onshore flow and picking up across southern parts of southeast. Winds are generally 15 to 20 across most of the interior. A little bit more of an easterly flow across the Yukon Valley, with wind speeds 10 to 35 knots around the Kotzebue Sound region. Northerlies for the chain, southerlies for southwestern Alaska. High pressure still in force there, and weak low pressure sitting across the eastern Gulf. So as far as turbulence goes, the main threat's going to be right and along and north of the Yukon Valley to the Brooks Range, below about 4,000 feet out towards St. Lawrence Island. Watch for areas of considerable moderate, and it's mainly because of that difference in the speed across the region. We saw those 850 winds there, 3,000 level winds, running just a little bit faster than what we saw at 7,000 feet. So again, we'll be watching some of that low level wind shear and wind speed turbulence there as that goes throughout your Wednesday, and a chance for convection in southeast.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere, some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the Earth and grows our food. While the Sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the Sun doesn't stay at the Sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted, from causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. This is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane, about 30, 45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what this spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part, not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy. And then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore, and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button, it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button, it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from the space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system's going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to marine weather now. As we look up into the Chukchi Sea north of the Bering Strait, you'll notice the temperatures there are cooling down quickly. They're not quite as cold as what we see around the Beaufort. That is mostly ice covered at this point, all the way down to the northern parts of the Chukchi Coast that are cooling down, and you can see that ice edge and that cooler water that's making that ice growth possible is certainly making its way into the Chukchi Coast and closer to the Bering Strait. We still have some pretty warm water there, especially west and south of Nunivak Island. If you look at the scale with me there, you can see those temperatures are still hovering around 7 to 8 degrees above 7 to 8 degrees above zero or Celsius. So certainly some warm water hovering off the southwestern coast and cooling down around south central. You'll notice if you drive up in any of the arms, the Turnagain or the Knik, you'll notice some ice there across the upper ends from time to time. As you look at the ice edge, you can see the Beaufort Sea is covered up there just west of Utqiagvik. That ice edge is kind of leaning over a little bit more into the Chukchi. Still a lot of expansive open water there, but along the coast, some shore-fast ice that have colored in gray here today. You can see some of that in the upper end of the Kotzebue Sound region, but still looking at some marginal ice along the northern end of the Yukon Delta, and nothing so far in the Bering Strait. Here's a look at what we see in southeast Alaska there. Gusts will continue tonight. High wind warnings are expected to be rescinded around 6 o'clock tonight. Southeasterlies inside of Stevens Passage may gust up to 35 knots. Northerlies inland canal, 3-foot seas there. Offshore winds all the way north of Sitka, about 20 knots with a 10 to 11-foot sea. And south and southwesterlies south of Sitka, into Port Alexander and into the Dixon entrance, 25 to 30 knots, 14 to 15-foot seas. Look for a northerly flow to set up as we go into your Thursday. About 15 knots with 11 to 13-foot seas. Stronger gusts developing in the Lynn Canal. Some of those could howl up to 50 knots there with a southeasterly wind opposing that through the Clarence Strait and Stevens Passage with about 4 to 6-foot seas expected. For Wednesday in South Central, not too bad. 10 to 15 knots in all areas there. 2-foot seas on the inside of Prince William Sound outside of the Hitchinbrook entrance. 9-foot seas expected. Northeasterlies down the western Gulf, about 10 to 15 knots there with 8 to 9-foot seas, and 4-foot seas there in the western Barrens with a northerly wind at 15. Look for slightly stronger winds south of Kenai from Clam Gulch all the way outside of Homer and the Barren Islands up to 20 knots there with 5 to 6-foot seas by Thursday. Northeasterly winds continue across the northern Gulf, and light winds continue inside of Prince William Sound. 2-foot seas expected there again on Thursday. For Bristol Bay, northeasterlies 15 knots, 3-foot seas. A little less wind down the coast with 6-foot seas expected Wednesday. Northeasterlies will be the strongest there in the western Gulf, especially in Shelikof Strait up to 20 knots with 5-foot seas on Wednesday. That becomes 25 knots with 7-foot seas on Thursday. Easterlies pick up a little bit more around AKwx to Castle Cape, Chignik, and down towards Sand Point with 13 to 14-foot seas. North and easterly winds continue across the Bering Sea coast of the Alaska Peninsula with 20 to 25 and 5 to 6 foot seas there on Thursday. For the chain, northwesterly winds anywhere from 15 to 20 knots in total. 9 to 10 foot seas are expected across the Bering Sea coast and 5 to 9 foot seas there across the Pacific coast there with that northwesterly flow. As we get into Thursday, look for a little bit of a change. You'll notice that northerly winds still winning out for the eastern chain, but southerlies are moving into the central chain from Adak and Atka, 20 to 25 knots, 5 to 8 foot seas there, and a stronger easterly flow already feeding into the next low pressure system, 35 to 40 knots with 10 to 18 foot seas and building for Thursday into Friday. Northeasterly offshore winds continue for the west coast on Wednesday, 25 to 30 there with the exception of 15 knots in the Kuskokwim Delta, 4 foot seas expected, 13 foot seas around St. Matthews, 7 to 11 foot seas from the Norton Sound region to St. Lawrence Island on that 30 knot wind. For Thursday, winds diminish a little bit. Seas start to go down, 5 to 7 foot seas in many areas, 4 foot seas inside of Norton Sound, 7 foot seas around the Kuskokwim Delta. That offshore wind continuing there, a southeasterly flow lightens up even more for St. Paul and St. George, 10 knots with a 4 foot sea. 8 foot seas, though, still hold on around St. Matthew with a 25 knot wind. Look for a south and westerly wind for most of the Beaufort Seacoast, 20 to 25 knots with a little bit of open water there, 6 foot seas around Utqiagvik, and then we've got northeasterly winds coming from Cape Lisburne, moving toward low pressure out in the Bering, 15 to 30 knots there with 6 to 11 foot seas. For Thursday, offshore winds for Cape Lisburne and Kivalina, 10 to 20 knots with 2 to 4 foot seas, and a light west and southwesterly wind over the Beaufort Sea up to 15 knots. Northeasterlies around St. Lawrence Island will continue. Recapping tonight's weather, winter weather advisories for just about all of the interior. A high surf advisory for the Bering Strait communities there. That will continue until 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, as well as the winter weather advisories. Basically, if you're taking a highway up and over a ridge or going through some open flat land, you are going to see snow and some blowing snow, maybe a couple inches at best. High wind warnings this afternoon will be discontinued as we go through the evening hours for South Central. More wind and blowing snow for the interior until Thursday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.